Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening. My name is Mohd Shukri Hajinoor from the Faculty of Economics and Management, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, the National University of Malaysia. Today, we're going to discuss about this topic, whether international trade causes the poor become poorer. Before leaving the factor endowment theory of Shaolin, consider this question. Are Americans' incomes being pulled down by workers in Mexico or China because of international trade? Number two, is trade harming unskilled workers? Actually, economists agree some combination of trade, technological change, education, immigration, and union weakness that have held down wages for the unskilled American workers. But apportioning the blame, or to put the blame squarely or 100% on trade, is problematic and tough partly because income inequality is so pervasive. So we're going to use our example in figure 3.3 here, looking at the wage gap between the skilled versus unskilled workers, the wage gap among them, as mentioned earlier, caused by some combination of trade, tech change, education, immigration, and union weakness, income inequality, pervasive. Wages of skilled workers relative to those of unskilled workers actually are outcome of the interaction between supply and demand in the labor market. So figure 3.3, as mentioned earlier, wages of skilled workers versus wages of unskilled workers. We have in this figure 3.3, vertically we have wage ratio, and horizontal we have labor ratio. And this is the demand for labor, and this is the supply of labor. So we're going to define this wage ratio and labor ratio. Wage ratio is defined as the wage of skilled workers divided by the wage of unskilled workers. So as a result, if we go higher, it means that the ratio is greater for the wage of skilled relative to the wage of unskilled workers. Labor ratio, we define as the quantity of skilled workers divided by the quantity of unskilled workers. So if we move to the right, it means that more skilled workers relative to unskilled workers, the quantity. So we're going to look at the impact by each of the three here: international trade and tech change, immigration of unskilled workers, and education and training. So we're going to look at the result, but however, quickly, international trade and tech change will widen the wage gap between the skilled and unskilled. However, trade and tech change are not the only ones in play here. Let's consider immigration. On the other hand, also immigration of unskilled workers will lead to also widening of wage gap between the skilled and unskilled workers. On the other hand, education and training will narrow the gap between the skilled and unskilled workers, the wage. So let's go to the graph. So With international trade in the United States, we know that United States is relatively abundant with skilled workers relative to other countries. This is according to the theory of Hexaolin. We define or we assume, and which is true. United States has more skilled workers relative to the unskilled workers compared with other countries like, in this case, Mexico, for example, here. So, with trade, there is going to be more demand for the skilled workers in the United States, more demand. So, the demand curve here shifts to the right. So, we began here. This intersection of DO and SO. So, with trade, there is going to be more demand for skilled workers. So, relative to unskilled workers. So, the demand curve shifts to the right. Now, assume supply is constant. So, SO, so we have the new demand curve here. So, the wage ratio has gone up from 2 to 2.5. So, trade and tech change has widened the gap between the skilled and unskilled workers in terms of their wage. Let's consider immigration of unskilled workers. Immigration of unskilled workers got to do here with the supply curve. So assume Mexicans are being allowed into the United States and work in the United States, and because of that immigration of unskilled workers, so there is going to be a shift to the left in terms of the labor ratio, because more of unskilled workers, because we have defined earlier that labor ratio is the quantity or the number of skilled workers divided by the number of unskilled workers. So, with the immigration of unskilled workers from anywhere in the world, not only from Mexico, this will shift the supply curve to the left. So, assume that we hold this, the demand curve for the labor of the skilled versus unskilled here. So, we have the new point 2.5 from earlier 2.0. So, immigration of unskilled workers also lead to widening of gap, wage gap. Okay, number 2. On the other hand, education and training. When there's more education and training, there's going to be more supply of skilled workers. So, the supply curve shifts to the right. So, assume again, this is the demand curve. So, starting here, that we started, okay, 2.0, the wage ratio. So, because of training and education, now the wage ratio has gone down. So, education and training narrows down the gap between the wages of the skilled versus the unskilled. So, that was what we got here. International trade and tech change leads to wage gap, widening of wage gap. Immigration also. So, do not blame trade. Why blame on trade? That's my subtitle there. Why blame on trade? Immigration can cause also widening of wage gap. However, on the other hand, education and training will narrow the gap. So it implies that for a country to help the unskilled workers, train them, give them education, retrain them, so that will narrow the gap. So do not blame squarely and 100% on the international trade. This we'll discuss in chapters coming up, in one of the chapters coming up, when we deal with the trade adjustment. Because of opening up a trade, some section of society will be affected, so there is a trade adjustment. Okay, done. Now, we're gonna bring you to the empirical study to support our claim. Why should you blame on trade? So, empirical study. Klein, 1997, found that during 1973 until 1993, tax change was about 4 times. 4 times. 2 times mean 100%. 3 times. So, 400% is more powerful in widening wage inequality in the United States than did trade, which accounted for only 7 percentage point, whereas more as a result of the tax change, not simply because of trade. So why blame on trade? Lawrence, 2008, found that rising wages inequality during the first decade of 2000s, recall the subprime crisis of 2005 and 2006 that spread to the banking crisis and spread to the Wall Street and spread to the global economic recession of 2008 and 2009. He found that during the first decade of 2000s, more closely corresponds to asset market performance and tax change and institutional innovation rather than to international trade. Because of assets market was booming up, so not simply because of trade. So why blame on trade? Is international trade responsible for the loss of American manufacturing jobs? What about robots? So machines do much of the work today that humans used to do. Automation of American factories is more important factor than international trade. The automation is more of a factor than international trade in the loss of American factory jobs. So presence and impacts of robots will grow over time and growing every day. So conclusion from our discussion today, apportioning the blame of job losses on international trade is misleading by those who oppose free trade and problematic, as there are a combination of factors involved in the labor market as well as factors outside of the labor market, such as asset prices that we saw from what Lawrence found, as well as tax change and innovation. So, thank you for watching. Assalamualaikum.